Okay, Mark, welcome to the show. To get started, could you maybe just give us a brief overview of your trajectory and how you ended up working in addiction?
Oh, right, excellent. Yeah, it's basically I got clean and sober from addictions myself. In 1996, I went to a rehab in Bournemouth in the south of England, and basically I met a therapist there who was also Scottish from Glasgow, and he was from a similar type of background. His family were actually involved in sort of more bank robbery type stuff, but and he was a therapist, and I remember when I met him and he was my therapist, I thought, right, God, this guy's really changed his life around from where he came from, poor working class area in Glasgow at the time, Easterhouse, and he's now a therapist, and he was quite a leading therapist at the time. So that was definitely an influence. There's different strands of it here. There's also one of the strands, I guess, is that when I was a child, my father was an alcoholic. I grew up and my grandfather was an alcoholic. So I grew up in a family where there was a lot of addiction. So from a young age, there was two aspects to it. One was that I often make a joke that there's more psychopaths per square foot in Glasgow than there is anywhere in the world. I grew up around quite a lot of sort of violent people, really, could be violent people, and I had to navigate those relationships even as a child, really. And anyway, in Glasgow, you've got all the sectarian stuff, as you know, and it's just like a little Belfast, really, Glasgow. But so I grew up sort of helping, really, my father, basically like a wee counsellor, really, to my father when I was young. When I got clean as well in '96, I was really fortunate because I was only like 2 weeks clean in this rehab, and I met at the time Eric Clapton, and I went to this 12-step, this fun night in Brixton. It was like a music night, and it was really bizarre. It was bizarre because this friend took me there, and from the rehab, from the actual detox, and he says, "Oh, we'll go to this music thing because this band are playing. They used to support Jimi Hendrix. They were like, they were sort of part of this. That this band used to support Jimi Hendrix in the Isle of Wight festival. So I went there to see this band, and this guy who's still a friend of mine who knew Jimi Hendrix and had a popular band at the time, a hippie sort of 60s band." And Eric came in, and my friend says, "That's Eric Clapton." And I was like, what would Eric Clapton be doing here? Like, it's like a basement of this church in Brixton. It's a winter's night. It's horrible. There's like 60 or 70 of recovering addicts all roaming around. And it's like, and he says, because he's in recovery and he's got a rehab in Crossroads and in Antigua, and you know, he does a lot of stuff. He does a lot. So anyway, long short of it, I had a poster of Eric on my wall when I was a kid. I had a poster of him and Jimmy Page for Zeppelin, and both of them I know quite well. And I then and it was and then I wound up speaking to him, and so there's certain influences that were really strong in the beginning of my recovery, like really they're really poignant, like meeting Eric, you know, my early childhood stuff around my dad, meeting in this therapist in this rehab who I knew sort of his family in Glasgow, and they all contributed to this thing of like, oh, I can turn this negative, this darkness, really. It wasn't all negative, look, because addiction's not always negative. There's good, look, nobody would carry on. If it wasn't fun at the beginning and it wasn't exciting and adrenalized, then you wouldn't do it. But so it's not all, it starts off good and then it starts descending. If you've got an addictive personality, it starts descending into the darkness through time and you cross a line. So I thought, how can I use the experience, my own personal experience too, and my personal experience was quite crazy. A lot of it was crazy. It was really like more extreme sort of behaviours really in addiction, as in the smuggling and going across borders from where it's death penalty and taking really crazy risks. Physically and to my mental health, I suppose, as well as in the pursuit really of money and the pursuit of status and kudos, and so that was some of the backdrops really of and the sort of building blocks really are then becoming a therapist, and then along the way, and then I was really keen to learn as well. I was really fascinated by Jung and Freud and these sort of early therapists, and I was really keen to know about myself, to arm myself with some facts, really to get to know myself, so that addictive part of me, I had a sort of mental defense against it. So the more knowledge I had about the more knowledge I had about myself and more awareness of myself, the more I could see that sort of twin that resides inside me that wants to take me back, that can take me back to the craziness really and the pain that comes with it.
100%. It's so interesting, Marc, just to get a brief glimpse of your story. Just for anybody listening, this is really only scratching the surface. Like, if you want to learn more, we don't have time to get into it in this interview, but if you want to learn more about Marc's story, he's got a book, I think it's called Nothing to Declare, where you go through this, and there's some fascinating stories in there, which we can't get into now, but maybe that's for another time. So next, Marc, I would like to sort of ask you about what your definition of addiction is, and what do you perceive to be the root causes of addiction?
Well, this is interesting. So, how I see addiction is, and we're in a modern day society now. Addiction, if we look at how people even use phones and social media, we can see how addicted people are to their phone. I mean, this phone that we're talking through now is like the modern day hypodermic needle, really, isn't it? I mean, I know Anna Lembke talks in Dopamine Nation about this, but it's true. So dopamine is any behavior really that causes an impact, causes negative consequences, causes harm, that a person keeps repeating and wants to change but can't stop it, really. And so it's any sort of maladaptive behavior that causes them and those around them pain, and they are psychologically or physically dependent on that behavior. And so, and it's interesting because Anna talks in her books about, as hunter-gatherers and thousands of years, we would have came from a position of scarcity. And we've got an abundance, isn't it? We've got abundance around us of stimulus. Like as soon as I turn on the phone, I've got I go on a dating app, or I go on, Uber Eats, or I get something delivered, or Amazon, or I can shop, or I can, there's just a multitude of different things that I can fix on. Now, for me, then my addictions took the form of drugs and alcohol from a young age. Now, at a younger age, sort of not pre-puberty, but certainly just after I hit puberty, I started to use cannabis. But before pre-puberty, I was also drinking from a young age. I got exposed to alcohol, alcoholic family. So, I know that there's twin study. Obviously, there's twin studies, and they can see that 50% of those, that go up in very different social environments still they still develop addiction. So you'd say, okay, well, is there a genetic factor? is there a predisposing gene? But then I tend to think, and it's like with Gabor Mate and stuff, that there's actually, do you know what's interesting? I was at one of his events. I was at Gabor's event. I wound up talking to him for a while, but I was at one of his events recently, and I said, Gabor, I get the impression then that if you deal with the trauma, and I'm trained as a traumatologist as well, but if you deal with the trauma, then it's almost happy days. Like you could just, if you deal with the underlying issue, which is the trauma, the PTSD, and you learn sort of coping strategies, how to deal with the low self-esteem and the hypersensitivity and such like, then almost you wouldn't have an addiction anymore. You could drink social. And I asked him that, so do you think that? And he says, well, what part of you is asking? He turned it back on me really by saying, well, what part of you is asking that? Because he didn't want to. Because I said, look, I've been clean and sober for 25 years, and I've seen a multitude of people who deal with trauma, who deal with the underlying issue, and then they start drinking again, and they start using drugs again, and they're dead. Two of my best friends in Ireland, who were Irish from Dublin, are both dead, and they picked up. They stayed sober for 10 years, and another one 14 years. And the 14 year, one of the guys, the 14 years had been sexually abused by the Christian Brothers, and I got a massive payout, and I mean, this is a while ago now when they started paying out all the victims, but so I tend to think there is neglect. I think the root of it is that there's often, with loads of men that I work with and the women as well, there's often an emotionally absent parent, and it's often a father as well that I see, especially with the men. So there seems to be this thing where in the developmental stages, and when they're of the child, where there's a level of criticism or a sort of abandonment or neglect from one or both the parents, there seems to be this thing where the child starts to internalize that message about themselves and say, I'm not. And what's interesting about this is you could have two children, you could have twins, and a father could be telling each of them off in exactly the same way. He could be saying, look, you've done this wrong, and one of the twins, the child that's got the hypersensitivity will go over it and over it and over it in their mind and internalize it and make it about them, and whereas the other child can just brush it off and not be affected by it, doesn't give it a second thought. So then you think, okay, is it the combination then? Is addiction the combination of sort of neglect and maybe a hypersensitivity or a temperament, things that one child maybe is much more sensitive now? And then you think, well, okay, so the sensitivity, where does that come from? Were they born very sensitive? Are they born really sensitive children right from the go-get? Or is there factors that's happened along the way that's made them much more sensitive around how do they process stuff or what, but certainly if I just relate it to me and what I see with loads of my friends that are in recovery and loads of the women that I've worked with in rehabs throughout the years and years and private clients, is there's often this, they often have at the core some core messages about themselves which creates low self-esteem, and which relates to the schema stuff that we'll talk about it. Well, we'll do the training about, but so they've often got these core messages and projections. It's funny because Mark Twain says, I've gone through many terrible things in my life, most of which never happened. And what I can see is that with people with addictions, they can see these areas of the brain that they can see that there's a dopamine deplete, like Russell Brand done, and Professor Nutt and Chip Summers done a little, it was just like a little podcast about it actually, that they can see through fMRI scanning of the brain. They can see there's, with people with addictions as opposed to those that don't have addictions, they can see dopamine production is depleted, They can see the part of the brain that deals with impulse control and also stress management. Those three areas of the brain they can see are compromised, as opposed to people who don't have addiction. So you think, well, where did that begin then? The dopamine depletion, did that because it's a really big factor, because if there's a dopamine depletion, not just that as a neurotransmitter that it gives pleasure, but it lays down memory and provides meaning and purpose in life. So if I've got a dopamine depletion, and this goes back maybe to some of the stuff that Anna Lembke, I don't know if she's mentioned this in a book, but if I was saying a tribe, like way back in a tribe, and if I was more depressed because I had a depletion of dopamine, the likelihood is I would get ostracized by the tribe members. So it would be a survival threat if I had a dopamine, because if I'm ostracized by the tribe members, right, and put out the tribe, I can't fend for myself, I can't survive. So if I take it forward and I'm going into a pub and I pick up a pint of beer, and as soon as I drink it, I get a dopamine, it's a dopamine reinforcer and an uplifter. So as soon as I take that drink, that sends a message to the survival part of the brain too, that actually a depletion of dopamine. I know it's like reptilian brain stuff, but basically it sends a message saying that you've got the right amount of dopamine now. You've got homeostasis, really, of, so as opposed to somebody who's already got enough dopamine, when they take a pint or they take a drug or whatever it is, it could be other things. It could be sex. It could be anything, really, gambling, that they've already got enough dopamine. So their brain, their reward pathway works in a very different way. Whereas mine's recognises as a survival threat. So it says, keep taking this, take more, to get the right amount of dopamine. And so I think that's quite fascinating, how the brain, I mean, I'm sure in the years to come, through fMRI scanning, they'll be able to see, and they'll be able to see with young kids. I think they'll start to be able to see it's resource intensive, isn't it? They need to spend a good bit of money on this but I'm pretty sure if they took groups of young people and put them in fMRI scanning and looked at the brain, you could then identify which ones have got the predisposing factors who are likely to develop addictions. And then what do you do then? Do you then give them education? Do you then do programs to build self-esteem? Do you, or certainly you tell them, look, you're highly at risk of becoming an addict, an active drug addict, or alcoholic, or gambler, or sex addict, or shopping addict, or whatever it is.
That's fascinating, Marc. You've covered things there that I've never heard of before. Just that idea around sensitivity, and that might be one of the key factors that actually leads to addiction later in life. That makes a lot of sense. And I think anybody that is a researcher, that could be a really interesting area to explore. And then the evolutionary explanation as well, where and this is wild speculation, and this might be completely wrong, but it would make sense to me from, if we were hunter-gatherers, and if I had a tendency, if I had a dopamine deficit, then that's going to make me want to hunt more and want to go out and pursue things more. And I'm going to be wired that way, and I'm going to get rewarded for that as well. So it seems that might even be like hardwired into some of our biology, just because if we had that, if our ancestors had that, does that make sense?
Yeah, completely. Now, and then you take it a bit further. You say, well, actually, some of the addicts, so some of the people with addictions would have been maybe the entrepreneurs of the tribe, right? Because if you imagine, if they've got a deeper need to get the dopamine, so say there's like 10 people and they've all got enough dopamine, right? There's 9 others that have got enough dopamine. They don't need any more. They're not looking for any because validation, right? Instead, like getting external validation gives a lot of dopamine, right? And serotonin. So, and oxytocin, well, not oxytocin, but serotonin for sure. But so you imagine if I'm in a tribe and I've got a dopamine depletion and I need more dopamine, right? And then they say, well, who's going to be the leader of the tribe? Who's going to be the leader of the tribe? Or who's going to take risks? Because every tribe would you need the people that are going to jump in the water and make sure there's no crocodiles in there, or who's going to be more adventurous to go across terrain to then attack other tribes or whatever it might be. So the guys, there's a school of thought. My friend wrote a book about this really as well, and he tended to think that they would have been they would be the watchers of the tribe. They'd be like the gatekeepers of the tribe, the people with addictions, because of the hypersensitivity. They could feel more. They're more intuitive. There's more. They're more empathic, right? And because they're in one respect, they're overexposed and underprotected to some degree. But then there's the other side of it is that sensitivity. They can just really use that, and they're very myopic. People with addictions are really sort of like, what makes Eric say for example, and it's transferable skills. Look, what makes these same people, and Eric, what makes him a phenomenal guitarist is his addiction, right? Is because he plays that instrument over and over and over again till he reaches perfection with it. He's got the unrelenting standards life trap. He's got that really, it's the schema. He's got that significantly, right? What makes Russell such a good comedian, right? Or really talented? It's like, is that sort of addictive? Is that super addictive sort of tendency? Is that so that can be transferred? So as opposed to how people are viewed in society as that people with addictions are weak-willed, it's actually the opposite. They're very strongly willed. People with addictions are sort of myopic, and they're often very rebellious and just really willful. But it's when the addiction gets sorry, I just need to let can you see me still? Can you see? Right, let me just get this. Yeah, can you see me? Yeah, right. It's when the addiction is focused on a destructive pattern, then you've got a problem. So you can channel I just think I think that's what would have probably happened in tribes. The people that were much more dopamine, that seek dopamine, they would have taken more risks. They would have looked for more validation, and the likelihood is they would have been quite respected in the tribe because they were so driven, and they would have stood out from the sort of more the people who didn't really have those same drives.
100%. There's so many questions that are coming to mind here. So I'm going to try and pick a couple that might be interesting. So it strikes me then that knowing that for someone that might be struggling with an addiction now, just the mere knowledge that the same thing that is causing them a lot of trouble in their life, that can be channeled into something productive that can benefit themselves and others. Like you hear stories all the time. People, turn their lives around like yourself and do an incredible amount of good in the world. There's a guy, Rick Roll. He was an addict. He was an alcoholic, and he's got a similar story. So that's the first thing. And then, what was the other thing I was going to say? It seems to be that the root of this one of the core sort of problems here is that there's a belief we have that we're not enough, and the addiction is sort of like an adaptive strategy to sort of get that basic need met. And then I was going to ask as well, and after you've been through recovery, and what have you found most helpful for keeping that going and thriving in day-to-day life? What habits and everything have benefited you, would you say?
Oh, well, I would say what's benefited me as opposed to maybe what other people in recovery, is that I've continued to push myself forward. Like I think addiction works in a lot of different ways. It not just like, so the drugs and alcohol or whatever behavior it is, gambling, sex, that's only the symptom of the addiction. That's just what the person does to medicate, right? So what you've got to look at is, so what is it they're trying to medicate? What does the longing long for, right? When you're an addict, you're always longing for this. There's never enough drugs. There's never enough alcohol. There's never enough sex. There's this insatiable appetite. I mean, we write this, so many songs are about it, and it can't get the satisfaction. All that thing is. So there's this thing of chasing this thing inside, the chasing, and but there's a futility with it, because you can never get. I mean, I sat and I remember sitting in, I'd sit in these crazy places, like I remember sitting in this guy's house. It was like away up in the Himachal Pradesh in a place called Manali, and it was a place called Milan. It was a different village. And when I was 21 years old, and I remember the room that I was sitting in, there was about 200 kilo of hash in the room. He was like, and so it was right up in North India, and it was right in the farm where they produce all the local people just would rub the plants and produce the cannabis. So I was right, and so I was right at the centre, and I was buying the first time I was just buying a few kilos. It was like not much. I was buying a few kilos just to bring back and smuggle it back. But I remember sitting there and I was thinking, God, I want to get all of this. I want to take all of this back with me. I want to try and get like a truck load of this back to the UK. And what would happen, even if I could have got a truck? I mean, later on, I managed to get card loads of it back through customs. But even if I could get all of that, there would still be this thing of I want more. It's like this. So okay. So then I stopped using drugs and alcohol, and the addiction morphs into other areas, right? Because as soon as I'm not getting a fix from drugs or alcohol anymore, it looks for expression. Addiction looks for expression in some other area. So then it would go into, at the very beginning for me, it was gambling. It was like, oh, well, the next thing you could do, you could get a hit from gambling, and that's not a drug, And then I got like caught gambling in the rehab when I was in the rehab. So then it stops, and then it's like, okay, I need to get a girl, I need to get women, so I need to then, what can I fix on? I can fix on the girls in the rehab because there's some hot women in the, it's like it goes into, I've got to get it, because that will fill the void inside me. But so I mean, Jung talked about this years ago. I mean, a long time ago, he said that addiction's a spiritual malady. He said it's like the person's looking for God, but they're looking for God. They're looking now. Not necessarily he's talking about something existential or Christian or any of that. He's saying the person's looking to fill that vacuum inside with whatever behavior it is, and so you've got to find, I've had to find like my version of God. I've had to, now it sounds simplistic, but it's not, and it's not as easy as that, because you keep forgetting. In recovery, I can like follow some sort of spiritual pursuit, or I can follow some sort of principles in my life to live by. But then I've got the addictive part of me that keeps saying, all right, but look at that there, that looks really shiny, that looks really nice. You need some of that. And that's the sort of battle really in recovery, is just because I stay clean for 25 years and 25 and a half years clean and sober, doesn't mean that then that's it, done and dusted. I'm not an addict anymore. That's not at all, because I've still got an addictive personality. It's just that I'm in recovery from it. I just don't act on. And then you could say, well, has everybody really to some degree got addictive personalities? Is it actually, the whole society really has got addicted? It's just that some addictions are socially acceptable, like the workaholic who works the chief executive of the bank, or the or the guy who's in private equity or asset management or hedge fund, who's chasing like 100 million bonus funds and getting commissions, and is he an addict really? But he's an addict to money and status and kudos and power that money gives. But it's a socially acceptable addiction. Or the person who's in the gym all the time, or the woman or the man who's in the gym all the time, or who's obsessed with their diet and upset, so you could say that, it's just like, for me also, I think what really has helped is I'm in 12-step fellowships. I've been in them for years. I really like them. I also I've tried to not let my addiction keep me small. My addiction tries to keep me small, tries to restrict my growth, and it does it through the limitations of my imagination. So that twin, that addictive part or subpersonality within me will say things like, "Oh, you can't possibly do a traumatology degree, or you couldn't achieve that, or you couldn't write a book, or you couldn't get that book into a film, or you couldn't do a podcast, or you couldn't." It tries to restrict my growth. And it's funny, I've got a friend called Simon Woodruff who created Yo Sushi, and he talks about this all the time, is that if I keep myself in my comfort zone, I don't grow, right? And if I don't grow, right, because I don't take risks and I don't push myself through my fear, and build resilience through that, then that impacts my self-esteem. And if my self-esteem, and if my self-esteem is not growing, and generally, if we think everything in life, plants, everything, if it's not growing, it's usually stagnating or it's decaying. So if I'm not growing, I'm much more at risk of going back to my addiction. So I'm always sort of like trying to push myself forward and learn and grow and get wiser, and because I can see that I can't stay stagnant, really. I can't, like yesterday's shower's not going to keep me clean today. Do you know what I mean? I have to, if I went to the gym yesterday, if I don't stop going to the gym, or I stop doing swimming or whatever it might be, I'm going to get unfit. I'm going to get physically unfit. So I have to apply the same principles. So what do I do for my recovery today? And what is it I keep doing to keep me on the track that I want to be on? Because it's like that we say in the fellowship, if I don't change the man that brought me into recovery, that same man will take me back out. So because I'll go back to the old template, because that's my sort of default position, is to go. So even if I came out here, just on a really practical level, if I bumped into somebody downstairs and I got really angry with them and I sort of threatened them, or I was really rude to them, my behavior would be of the same type. So I would be thinking the same ways I used to think, which is like self-centered and indifferent and intolerant. And my feelings would be obviously anger or rage. And the behavior would be this hostility towards the person. And then, of course, I'd feel that would impact my self-esteem, how I really feel about myself as a man, right? Whereas if I walk out of this building and I bump into somebody and I say, "Oh, sorry, mate, sorry, I never seen you there," and we have a friendly exchange, I feel quite good. I feel, because I'm thinking differently, I'm feeling differently, and I'm behaving differently. And that applies that. That's just an example, but that, in recovery, that's why it's much more than just stopping using drugs or alcohol. It's about an ongoing change of personality. That's what defines where somebody's in recovery, or whether somebody's they're just sober or clean and they're not changing. Because in some respects, if you take away there's this, we say you can take rum out the fruitcake, but you're still left with the fruitcake. It's like, I can, if I don't have some type of program, I could be worse than I was before because I've not got any medication, you know. So to some degree, I could have more anger or rage sober and clean than I would when I had drugs and alcohol, because the drugs and alcohol helps sedate some of that anger or rage.
100%. So do you think this is why whenever, I'm not sure if they do this or not, I think I've heard this, but in AA meetings,
Yeah,
sort of have to say, you know, I've been an alcoholic for this amount of years,
yeah.
and they continue to identify as an alcoholic. And do you think the reason they do that is because it means that you can't get complacent and you realize that every day slip up? Is that why they do that?
Because what they do, why they do it is that's the first step, right? In the 12 steps is to admit that you are an alcoholic or an addict, is to say, I can see it's a humble thing. It's the whole thing of humility, is that you can only sort of recover. You can't sort of graft a new idea on a closed mind. The only way I got clean and sober was I had to reach a point where my ego was deflated enough that I could ask for help. Right now, if my ego was so strong and it said, no, I know best and I can do this on my own, that pride, that ego eventually will kill you. If you just think of the amount of people that, even the sort of celebrity people you see that they die, they pick up after years, or they commit suicide. I mean, just even last year, a few years ago, there was Caroline Flack, there was Keith Flint from Prodigy, there was Philip Seymour Hoffman, who had relapsed and he tried to get clean again. Robin Williams, who took his the amazing comedian, they were all people with addictions, and they had various times of sobriety and well, not Caroline Flack so much, Keith Flint was a little bit, but it's basically, you can see that there has to be in order to get well, there has to be you have to concede to your innermost self that you have this, whether they call it an illness or whether, I know a lot of people go, oh, God, illness, but it would certainly be categorized now if we were as a disorder, like an eating disorder. So basically, the whole thing is about being in a meeting and saying, my name's Mark, I'm an addict. I'm recognizing and saying to the group, I suffer from the same condition as you guys do. And also that I'm open to hearing new information, and I need to follow a path of recovery. And and it reinforces in your mind, oh, this is what, because it's an insidious, cunning process. Like it works unconsciously on so many people. They don't understand how they got into the position that they picked up a drink or drug again after years. They think, how did that happen? And it's because unconsciously they make decisions which seem quite irrelevant decisions, but can have really catastrophic outcomes, and so you're, by having a program, you can sort of guard against, you can get a sort of mental defense against it.
Yeah, 100%. Now, I suppose that makes me curious to ask, do you think people have to hit rock bottom? Because it seems a big part of recovery is that you have to get the ego out of the way. And if the ego's still there and still strong, you're always going to make rationalizations. And then the other thing I wanted to ask as well, Mark, it's becoming increasingly obvious that addiction has very little to do with specific substances themselves. Obviously, there are substances that are addictive.
Yeah, sure.
But it can be anything. It can be gambling. It can be...
Yeah.
I think Gabor Mates, he used to buy records,
Yeah.
Anna Lembke was romance novels, So
Romance,
I'm curious,
yeah.
From your experience working on Harley Street, you specialize in addiction. Have you come across any common addictions that people might not even be aware of? I just want for people to be aware that this happens. Like, it can happen with anything, you know?
A massive one too is codependent relationships. People getting into, I mean, work's a massive one for some people who are just working all hours of the day. They don't turn their phone off. It interferes. Like, it's much more subtle, isn't it, the work one? Because, you know, as I said, like, they're celebrated in society. Somebody who's making lots of money or who's successful can be like put on pedestals, really, within their society. But if you imagine somebody's like working from 7 o'clock in the morning till 10 o'clock, or, you know, checking emails right up till 9, 10 o'clock at night, and they've got a partner or they've got kids, what's happening there is that they're neglecting, and what happens is, as well, is water seeks its own level. You can attract other people. Often you know, you can just attract other people who are also workaholic, and then it becomes like, oh, you're both workaholics together, and then you know, it's, you know, and that's definitely a big one that I've seen. Workaholism. I've seen definitely codependent relationships where people deprioritize their own needs, and they make somebody else more important, or they make the man or the woman more important than looking after themselves. So they keep entering relationships where they're really abandoned, or they pick cold, unavailable partners, and they keep going, well, why is this one? It's like, it's almost like, you know, it's quite interesting that a lot of that's unconscious too. Unless you get sort of well and get really a lot of awareness around that, you can start. And that's why it's important for people to date people or get, so that they can make a sort of more thoughtful, considered decision rather than just jump into something. And then the fantasy of the person, as opposed, people get really hooked into the fantasy of who they think the person is rather than who they really are. And then the person shows up maybe a year later when they're living with them. They go, God, I didn't like this about him. I didn't like this about her. Or, you know, I didn't know she was, you know. So I think around love and sex and codependence, there's like, you know, there's people. I mean, I see a lot of people around those areas. Certainly gambling, certainly work. In the past, I've seen a lot, you know, people who are really addicted to the gym and exercise, you know, and it's interesting. There's situations where people they stay in denial around their addiction because they're really they're high achievers, you know, like, so they'll do really well in their work, and they're making lots of money, or they're doing really well because they're really focused on that area as well. So they're very manageable around their work, but they're still maintaining some type of addiction with drugs or alcohol. And so it's just quite. Or they'll maybe be doing loads of exercise. They'll be able to do Ironmans and do these mad ultra marathons. They'll go and do it, and they'll say to themselves, well, if I was like an alcoholic or an addict, there's no way I could do like 50-mile runs across these mountains, and, you know, like, these landscapes, or be in these hot deserts and do, you know, and it's just another mechanism to stay in denial around their addiction, you know, because it's like a rationalization, a justification that they can sort of hide it, you know. And that's why I'm saying it's really insidious and cunning when you break it down, how people, what sort of, you know, in their mind, what kind of narratives they create that help justify the behavior.
That's so interesting. So, you know, Marc, if I was, let's say that we're sitting on Harley Street here now, and I have to come to you and say, look, Marc, I'm pretty sure I am a workaholic, and I really need some help with it. How would you approach, you know, as a therapist, how would you approach helping someone in that situation?
Okay, so I would find out about their relationships. I'd find out about, you know, their children, their wife or their husband or their partner, or, you know, I'd find out a wee bit about that and the impact, and what is the like, try and get to the root of it and say, well, okay, so what's the consequences what's the outward consequence of the behavior? What have you done in the past to try and change it? What's been useful and what's not been useful? And then and just get an understanding of exactly how it manifests, how the worker, and then start to say, okay, well, what is the driver below it? What is it that's going on underneath? The work is just a symptom, right? This is just what you do. But what is it you feel about yourself? So then I start to explore with maybe one of the tools from Reinventing Your Life, the Jeffrey Young book, the Schema Therapy, say, okay, let's look at the schemas. Let's look at the unrelenting standards. Let's look at the sense of it. I mean, we've got 11 in that book. There's 11 schemas: abandonment, defectiveness, vulnerability, social exclusion, emotional deprivation, entitlement, subjugation, failure. You'd start to look at what schemas and identify which ones are really active, and what the scores are for those particular schemas. And then we go through and we prioritize the ones that are most active, the highest scores. So say unrelenting, like workaholics, going to have unrelenting standards. They're going to be perfectionistic for sure. They're going to keep. So you'd look at that unrelenting standards. So you'd look at the positives of it. The positives are, yeah, you're a high achiever. You're this particular, like somebody like Elon Musk. What he's got unrelenting standards, right? Tesla. So he if you look at his childhood with the father and everything, and how he grew up, there was an abandonment. Really, there was an abandonment, and then how he got self-esteem really is by that complete drive. This is what I mean. Lots of successful people are entrepreneurs, are people really with addictions, but they've turned it. And lots of sports people, your tennis players, and football players, they often go into gambling addictions or sex and love addictions, but the footballers more than anything else. But so you look at that unrelenting standards life chart and go, okay, the benefits are this, but what are the consequences when you are just continually driven from morning to night, and you've got the money that you wanted, but yet you still can't stop. You're not able to consolidate. You're not able to step back and go, like, what kind of quality of life? You're driven by this sort of like sergeant major in your head, really, that just keeps on pushing you and pushing you. And so who's really in charge? Is your addiction in charge, or are you in charge? So you've got to get them to say, okay, and how do you want to change it? What do you want? What kind of quality of life do you want? How do you want to take control? Or how do you want to get control of your life again? And then then I would be like, okay, this is how we're going to meet. We're going to meet every week. We're going to focus on this. How do we recognize changes? You set some sort of benchmarks really of what you would like to, and you set some rules. You say, it's a bit different the way I work with addictions as like a normal therapist. Not a normal therapist. I used to do some trainings for the BACP, and the normal therapists don't give advice, and they don't, it's much more, they're like much more person-centered, and they're not so interactive. And I mean, that was what counselling was like years ago. I mean, it was usually, most counsellors in this country historically were white middle-class women who got jobs while their husbands were working, and they had it as this like side profession. But that, when those types of individuals are working with people with addictions who are they're bright, people with addictions can often be quite bright, and they're quite and very manipulative, and like you have to hold them accountable. You have to be very directive with people because ultimately the addiction can kill them, right? And I've had this before where clients have had, they're wound up dead, and I always think, God, if I'm standing in front of a coroner and there's an inquest, I'm accountable. I'm a sole trader, really. I have to be like, what did I do? What did I do to ensure as much as possible that person was safe? Do you know what I mean? And as opposed to other sort of ailments, you know, that or emotional disturbance that people can have. When you're working with people with addictions, is they can take it to they'll take it to the. I mean, if they're using drugs or alcohol, they can wind up with a stroke or a heart attack. So it is fatal. So I'm often thinking, right, how do I ensure that? So with individuals, I always am like, okay, if if there's a risk to you, or there's always the three areas. You always say, like, if I'd need to inform, social services if it was anything to do with children or the abuse of children, or anything to do with terrorism, or anything to do with harm to you or others. I would have to, I have to, keep myself as a lone practitioner safe around that. So, if you're, so I would like your permission. If I thought you were going to kill yourself as a result, if you had suicidal ideation, or you had, or you were using loads of coke, and I thought you were really at risk of having a heart attack, that I could inform your mother or your father or your wife or husband, and I always really get consent to do that, because it prevents. Then I know that I've got a sort of process really that I can that's robust, where I've got more support really. And obviously I tell my supervisor, and the supervisor knows as well, so that there's a level of accountability. But I think, was there anything else I should add about that question? Is there anything else that you think now?
No, I think you've explained that really well. So this is my kind of understanding of what you said. So I'll repeat this back to you, and then you let me know if we're on the same page. So the first thing you do is you identify the context around them, their relationships, their sort of life circumstances, the present. And then after that, there you start getting into schemas, things that might have happened in their past. And then you're looking at how the behavior, the consequences of the behavior, how that's affecting their life, how that working 12 hours a day is negatively affecting the rest of their life. And then once they begin to see that, then you're asking, right, how do you want to change? What do you want to be different about your life? So you're getting them on board with actually making the change. And then together you're co-creating sort of strategies and rules so that you can treat the addiction. Is that?
And now probably what it says, I'd ask them at the beginning of how do they want to change it, what is their vision for themselves. So I'd probably do that. I would do that at the beginning, like, what is it they want to do about it? And then so that I know right from the go-get is that they want to change it, that they want to take action. Back to the point you said earlier, does somebody have to hit a rock bottom? Do they? And this is an interesting, because we've all got different pain thresholds, haven't we? So what might be an emotional pain threshold for you might be very different for me. So I never got clean till I was 32, for example. But I think it was in a lot of emotional pain way before that. I mean, I wanted to change it, say 7 years before that. My best friend died when I was 25. I think that was a jumping off point. I could have got clean when I was 25, maybe. But because of my pain threshold, my emotional pain threshold, I can put up with a lot of pain without incentive, without changing it, right? Whereas a friend of mine got clean when he was 17, right? So it's not necessarily about the rock bottom, it's about the person and about their threshold for pain. So my friend of mine who became a director, he's a really good director, his name's Nick Love, he does Football Factory and The Business and The Sweeney, he's done these really good movies. So say Nick would have got clean, he would have got clean much younger than that. So, it's like, because his pain threshold was like, this is enough for me, I need to go and get clean, So it just really depends on the individual, and equally. So then you think yourself, you think somebody like, say, Elton John, right, who got clean. My friend works for him, so he got clean a bit later. So he had no real consequences around his, because he's got a lot of money, resources. you know, still doing lots of really good music while he was in his addiction. But so there was no like, whereas if you think of somebody, a working class boy from Peckham Park Estate in London, who has to go out and steal every day and steal butcher meat or steal whatever he needs to steal to fund his habit. Somebody like Elton or Eric, they don't need to do any of that, right? So they're not going to prison, they're not going, but for them, what gets them is the emotional pain. Really, that it's not the circumstances so much around, oh, I've got to go to prison or I've got to keep on doing this, but it's the fact that they're in deep emotional pain and they can't deal with it any longer. So then they get clean. So it's quite interesting, this. And what I think is a really common theme is, whether people are religious or whether they're spiritual or not, most people I've ever met have a bottom where they reach, something inside them cries out to whatever it is, whether it's a religious God or whether but it cries out for help inside, and then is open and receptive to change. So there is something about that seems to happen, is that they hit this place where I can't do it anymore. Now that window can be short. Now this is the difficulties, and this is why I try and see people really quickly. You know, when somebody phones me, says I've got an addiction, because I know that it takes so much for somebody to get on the phone. A lot of the time, you know, your ego's got to be significantly reduced to go and ask for help generally. So what I try and do is, as soon as I get a call, I try and see them as quick as possible, because I know sometimes there's a short window when they're asking for help, and you can then go in and then give them the help that they need and set them on the path. And I know from my own experiences is that I had a few windows like that before I got clean, but then I never seen MD, because there was, you know, it's interesting, like drug services historically in Britain have been set up in a way where they book appointments. So say I go into a drug service, a normal drug service in the community, and they say, I say, I want to see somebody because I've got cocaine or I've got a crack problem. They'll say, okay, we'll give you an appointment for Tuesday next week at 2:00, right? Now, by Tuesday next week at 2:00, that's no use to me, right? Because look, if I phone a dealer now from Harley Street, that dealer will say to me, I'll meet you in Tesco's car park in 20 minutes. It's quicker than getting a pizza. I mean, quicker than that, maybe even 10 minutes. So the dealer is always the competitor for the drug service, right? The competition is, you know, so drug services and services generally, whether it's private or whether it's local authority funded, they have to be as effective really as the dealer. Because the dealer doesn't mess around, right? The dealer's like, right, we'll see you in 10 minutes, right? You've got to get the person in that moment of that window, because if you don't get them engaged, and that's why when I get the call, I'll say, look, I'll see you tomorrow at 9:00, or if I can do it, I'll see them the same day, because I know that if they've got the appointment and they think it's just, but maybe even if they still go to the car park and meet the dealer, it doesn't matter. There's 50-50 chance I've got them to come in, you know, whereas if I say, oh, I'll see you in a week's time, it's too far away, because when you're in drug addiction, 1 minute to the next can feel, you know, like you're just thinking about the next 10 minutes, you're just thinking about the next hour to keep yourself high, really.
What you've said there, that reminds me of Wendy Dryden's thing. He says, like, therapy is best provided at the point of need, and that makes a lot of sense. For you, I've just an observation, you know, like the contribution you're making to the addiction field and all the people you're helping. I just wonder, you know, would that be possible if you had not experienced the lows? So it's almost like the lows have shaped you in some way, you know?
Yeah.
And there's about a million other things I would love to ask you, Mark, but I know you've got to go. Your website, markdempstercounseling.com.
Yeah.
Book, Nothing to Declare. What's the other one called again?
The Ongoing Path.
The Ongoing Path. Definitely check those books out, people. And Mark's going to be one of 3 speakers at our forthcoming Day in Addiction, along with Anna Lembke and Marc Lewis, who's going to be presenting on IFS and addiction. So it's going to be a fascinating day. Mark, it's an absolute pleasure to meet you and learn from you. And I'm really looking forward to seeing you next month at the event. All right, take care.
Excellent. Okay, then. See you later now.